Every seat's the same. What, you think you're a pilot? The man beside her sneered when she asked to switch to 13F by the window. Olivia stayed silent, her eyes never leaving the sky. Minutes later she frowned and whispered, "Something's closing in." And at that very moment the cockpit sounded the alarm. A fighter jet was charging toward them at terrifying speed. The entire cabin froze. The woman in 13F had seen it before the radar. She wasn't loud or flashy, just a young woman in a plain gray sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry, nothing to catch the eye. But there was something about the way she sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap, that made you look twice. Not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't seem to need it. The businessman next to her in his crisp suit and gold watch had rolled his eyes when she'd asked to switch seats. He had muttered something about her faded jeans, like they told him everything he needed to know. But now, as the alarm buzzed through the cabin, his smirk was gone. Olivia just kept staring out that window, her face calm, like she was reading something in the clouds nobody else could see. The plane was a standard commercial flight, New York to London, packed with the usual mix of people. Families on vacation, executives tapping away on laptops, a couple of college kids scrolling through their phones. Olivia had boarded quietly, her small backpack slung over one shoulder, and slipped into her seat without a word. She didn't chat with the flight attendants or make small talk with her neighbors. She just sat there watching the sky as the plane climbed to 35,000 feet. When she'd asked to switch to the window seat, her voice was soft but firm, like she wasn't asking for permission, so much as stating a fact. The businessman, mid-40s, slicked back hair, the kind of guy who checks his watch every 5 minutes, had scoffed loud enough for the whole crowd to hear. "What's so special about 13F?" he'd said, loud enough to draw a few chuckles. Olivia hadn't answered. She just slid into the seat, her movements precise like she had done this 1,000 times before. Now, with the alarm blaring, those chuckles were long gone. A woman in a tailored blazer, her nails painted a sharp red, leaned across the aisle, her voice dripping with condescension. "You know, honey, if you're gonna make a scene, at least dress the part. That sweater's not doing you any favors." Her laugh was sharp, like she'd practiced it for moments like this. A few passengers nodded, their eyes flicking over Olivia's plain clothes, as if her faded jeans were a personal insult. Olivia's fingers paused on the window shade, her head tilting slightly. "Clothes don't fly planes," she said, her voice low but clear enough to carry. The woman's smile faltered, her nails tapping nervously on her armrest. The businessman snorted, trying to regain his footing. "Oh great, now she's giving fashion advice," he muttered, but his voice lacked its earlier bite. The cabin shifted, the air growing heavier, as if everyone was waiting for Olivia to say something else. She didn't. She just adjusted the shade, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was closing the door on the conversation. "Hey, if this story's hitting you, can you do me a quick favor? Grab your phone, hit that like button, drop a comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot to keep these stories going, and I'd love to know you're with me. Alright, let's keep moving." The cabin was tense now, the kind of tense where you can hear every creak of the plane. The businessman leaned over, his voice sharp. "What's that supposed to mean? Something's closing in. You trying to freak everyone out?" His tone was all accusation, like she'd done something wrong just by speaking. A woman across the aisle, maybe in her 60s with a pearl necklace and a tight perm, chimed in. "Young lady, you shouldn't say things like that. You're scaring people." Her voice dripped with that fake concern. "That's really just judgment." Olivia didn't turn her head. She just kept her eyes on the window, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. The flight attendant, a tall guy with a clipped mustache and a name tag that read Mark, strode over. "Ma'am, please, let's keep things calm. Just pick your meal and stay seated." His smile was tight, like he was trying to keep the situation under control, but didn't quite believe his own words. A man in a polo shirt, his face flushed from too many in-flight drinks, stood up and pointed at Olivia. "Hey, missy, you think you're some kind of hero? Sit down and stop acting like you're in charge." His voice was loud, slurring slightly, and it drew more eyes. A couple of passengers murmured in agreement, their stares hardening. Olivia's hand tightened on her backpack strap for a split second, then relaxed. She turned to him, her eyes steady. "I'm not in charge," she said, her voice even. "But someone needs to be." The man blinked, his bravado crumbling under her gaze. He sat down, muttering under his breath, but the words didn't carry. The older woman with the pearls clucked her tongue, shaking her head like Olivia was a disobedient child. Mark, the flight attendant, hovered nearby, his hands twitching like he wasn't sure what to do next. The cabin felt like a pressure cooker, every whisper and glance adding to the heat. The alarm from the cockpit cut through the chatter like a knife. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tight and urgent. "This is your captain. We've detected a high-speed contact on radar. Remain seated and follow crew instruction." The cabin went dead quiet for a split second, then erupted in whispers. People craned their necks trying to see out the windows. The businessman's face went pale, his gold watch glinting as he gripped the armrest. "What the hell does that mean?" he muttered, glancing at Olivia like she'd caused this. A teenage girl a few rows back clutched her mom's arm, her voice shaking. "Mom, what's happening?" The mom didn't answer, just stared at Olivia, her eyes narrowing. Mark was back, his voice louder now. "Everyone stay in your seats. We're handling this." But his hands were trembling as he adjusted his tie. Olivia didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass for a moment before she pulled back. A young mother cradling a toddler in her lap turned to Olivia with wide, frightened eyes. "You said something was coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. "What did you see?" Before Olivia could answer, the woman in the tailored blazer cut in her voice, sharp. "Don't encourage her. She's just looking for attention." The mother shrank back, clutching her child tighter. Olivia's eyes flicked to the toddler, who was staring at her with big, curious eyes. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a small worn keychain, a tiny metal plane, and handed it to the child. "Hold on to this," she said softly. The mother hesitated, then nodded, her hands trembling as she took the keychain. The businessman scoffed, but it was weaker now, like he was trying to convince himself. The cabin watched, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, as Olivia turned back to the window, her face unreadable. The businessman couldn't let it go. He leaned in, his voice low, but sharp enough for the nearby rows to hear. "You see through clouds now, What's next? You gonna fly the plane?" A couple of passengers snickered, but it was nervous laughter, the kind that comes when people are scared and looking for someone to blame. Olivia turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "If I need to," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. But it landed like a punch. The businessman blinked, his mouth opening, then closing. He didn't have a comeback. The older woman with the pearls huffed, folding her arms. "Ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some people just want attention." A guy in a polo shirt a few seats back piped up. "Yeah, what's her deal? She's acting like she knows something we don't." The cabin was turning on her now, the air thick with suspicion. Olivia didn't respond. She just adjusted her backpack under the seat, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was counting every second. A flight attendant with a clipboard, her lips pursed in a thin line, approached Olivia, her heels clicking on the cabin floor. "Ma'am, I need you to stop talking about things you don't understand," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "You're upsetting the other passengers." She gestured to a group of elderly travelers in the next row, who were whispering and glancing at Olivia like she was a threat. Olivia looked up, her eyes meeting the flight attendant's for a brief moment. "I understand more than you think," she said, her tone calm, but edged with something that made the flight attendant step back. The elderly group went quiet, their hands clutching their armrests. The businessman muttered something under his breath, but he didn't dare speak up again. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Olivia just turned back to the window, her fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, a rhythm only she understood. 5 minutes later, the captain's voice came back, and it was shaking. "This is your captain again. We've confirmed a fighter jet approaching at extreme speed. We're in communication with air traffic control." The words hit the cabin like a shockwave. The teenage girl started crying softly. A man in a suit 2 rows up stood up, ignoring the flight attendants, and pointed at Olivia. She said something was coming. How'd she know that? And they did the Zedaumt and that Herbstol. His voice was loud, accusing, and it lit a fuse. The older woman with the pearls turned in her seat. "She's trying to scare the children." "What kind of person does that?" The businessman leaned in again, his face red now. "She's clearly involved. Nobody just guesses something like that." Mark, the flight attendant, was back, his voice sharp. "Ma'am, sit down and stay quiet. We don't need this right now." Olivia didn't look at him. She didn't look at any of them. Her eyes were back on the window, scanning the sky like she was waiting for something specific. A flash of light cut through the clouds outside. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The fighter jet was visible now, a sleek dark shape slicing through the sky way too close for comfort. The captain's voice came again, almost frantic. Jet approaching at extreme speed. All passengers brace for potential impact. The businessman froze, his hands gripping the seat so hard, his knuckles went white. The older woman clutched her pearls, her face pale. The teenage girl was sobbing now, her mom whispering, it's okay, even though her own voice was shaking. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She murmured almost to herself, if they haven't fired, there's still a way out. Her voice was so calm it was eerie, like she was talking about the weather. The businessman whipped his head around. What did you just say? He snapped. But there was fear in his voice now, not just anger. Olivia didn't answer. She just kept watching the jet, her hands steady on her lap. A college student in a hoodie, his earbuds dangling around his neck, stood up, his voice cracking with panic. She's got to be working with them. Why else would she know what's happening? His accusation hung in the air, drawing more shouts from the crowd. The young mother with the toddler clutched the keychain tighter, her eyes darting between Olivia and the chaos around her. Olivia's gaze shifted to the student. For a moment, her expression unreadable. Sit down, she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made him freeze. He sank back into his seat, his face flushed. The flight attendant with the clipboard stepped forward again, her voice shaking. Ma'am, you need to stop this. You're making things worse. Olivia didn't respond. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open, her eyes scanning a page before she tucked it away. The gesture was so casual it felt out of place, like she was preparing for something nobody else could see. The cabin was chaos now. People were shouting, some praying, others just staring out the windows in stunned silence. A man in a hoodie, maybe in his 30s, stood up and pointed at Olivia. She knows too much. She's got to be a spy or something. His voice was wild and it set off a chain reaction. The older woman nodded, her lips tight. Why else would she know about that jet? She's dangerous. A younger flight attendant, a woman with a tight bun and nervous eyes, grabbed a seatbelt strap from an empty seat, her hands shaking. We need to restrain her, she said, her voice high-pitched. A guy in the back yelled, yeah, tie her up. She's gonna get us all killed. Another passenger, an older man with a cane, shouted, throw her off this plane. The words were absurd, impossible, but they carried the weight of fear. Olivia didn't move. Her eyes flicked to the cockpit door, then back to the window. She didn't argue, she didn't flinch. She just sat there like a statue carved from steel. An elderly man in a tweed jacket, his hands trembling as he gripped his armrest, stood up and addressed the cabin. I've been flying for 50 years, and I've never seen anything like this. She's not normal. His voice was shaky, but carried the weight of his years. The crowd murmured in agreement, their fear turning into a shared conviction. Olivia's eyes met his for a brief moment, and she tilted her head slightly, almost like she was acknowledging his fear. Normal doesn't stop jets, she said, her voice quiet but cutting through the noise. The man sat down, his hands still shaking, his face pale. The flight attendant with the tight bun stepped closer, her voice rising. You're not helping anyone, she snapped. Olivia didn't look at her. She just adjusted her backpack, her fingers brushing against a small faded patch sewn into the strap. A military insignia, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The captain's voice crackled again, this time with a new edge. Ma'am in 13F, please come to the cockpit. The cabin went silent, every head turning to Olivia. The businessman's jaw dropped. The older woman's pearls clicked as she clutched them tighter. Mark, the flight attendant, hesitated, then motioned for Olivia to follow him. She stood up, her movement smooth and unhurried, and slung her backpack over her shoulder. As she walked down the aisle, every eye was on her. Some were angry, some were scared, but nobody was laughing anymore. In the cockpit, the captain was sweating, his hands gripping the controls. You said something was coming, he said, his voice low. How did you know? Olivia didn't answer right away. She leaned over, glancing at the radar screen. Let me talk to them, she said, nodding at the radio. The captain stared at her, his face a mix of disbelief and desperation. After a long pause, he handed her the mic. Olivia switched the frequency with a flick of her wrist, like she'd done it 1,000 times. Her voice was cold, precise. Shadow 3 reporting. Identify yourself. The cockpit went quiet. The co-pilot, a younger guy with wide eyes, stared at her like she'd grown a second head. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but static. Then a voice came through, low and clipped. Shadow 3, this is Shadow 3. Stand down. The captain dropped the mic, his hands shaking. Shadow 3. He whispered. That unit was decommissioned 5 years ago. The The co-pilot looked at Olivia, his mouth open. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, but she didn't answer. She just handed the mic back and turned to leave the cockpit. The cabin was silent as she walked back to her seat, every passenger watching her, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. A businessman in a pinstripe suit seated near the front stood up as Olivia passed, his voice loud enough to carry through the cabin. "This is insane. She's got you all fooled." He pointed at her, his face red with indignation. "She's probably some hacker messing with the radio." The crowd stirred, some nodding, others shouting in agreement. Olivia paused, her hand resting on the back of the seat. "You're welcome to try the radio yourself," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge that made the man step back. He didn't take her up on it. The flight attendant with the clipboard rushed over, her face flushed. "Ma'am, please just sit down," he said, her voice cracking. Olivia nodded once, then slid back into 13F, her movements as steady as ever. The cabin watched, the tension so thick, it felt like the air itself was pressing down. The flight attendant with the tight bun wasn't done. She stepped in front of Olivia, her voice shaking but loud. "She's lying. Shadow 3 doesn't exist anymore. She's playing us." The businessman jumped in, his face red again. "We're being tricked." "Don't believe her." The older woman with the pearls nodded furiously. "She's putting us all in danger." The captain's voice came over the intercom again, weaker now. "If she's wrong, we'll be shot down." The cabin erupted in shouts, people talking over each other, some crying, some yelling at Olivia. A woman in a business suit stood up, pointing. "She's nobody. Why are we listening to her?" The chaos was deafening, the air thick with panic. Olivia sat back in 13F, her face calm, her eyes locked on the window. She didn't say a word. Her hands rested on her backpack, fingers tracing the worn straps like they held a memory. A young boy, maybe 10, sitting a few rows ahead, turned around in his seat, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Miss, do you know how to fly jets?" he asked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The cabin went quiet for a moment, every head turning to Olivia. She looked at the boy, her expression softening just a fraction. "I used to," she said, her voice gentle but firm. The boy's eyes lit up, but before he could ask more, the woman in the tailored blazer snapped, "Don't talk to her. She's dangerous." The boy shrank back, his excitement fading. Olivia's gaze lingered on him for a moment, then shifted back to the window. The businessman muttered something under his breath, but it was drowned out by the hum of the plane. The tension in the cabin shifted, a mix of fear and curiosity now, as if people were starting to wonder who she really was. Then out the window, the fighter jet tilted its wing. It was a slow, deliberate move, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. The captain's voice came over the intercom, soft and stunned. They saluted her. The cabin went quiet again, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat. The jet tilted its wing again, then broke formation, pulling alongside the commercial plane like an escort. The businessman sank back in his seat, his face ashen. The older woman's pearls slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. The flight attendant with the tight bun backed away, her hands trembling. Olivia didn't react. She just leaned back in her seat, her eyes still on the sky, like she'd known this was coming all along. The teenage girl across the aisle stared at her, her tears drying up. "Who is she?" she whispered to her mom, but her mom didn't answer. Nobody did. A middle-aged woman in a floral dress, her hands clutching a rosary, stood up and faced Olivia. "You're not one of us," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and accusation. "You're bringing trouble on this plane." The crowd murmured, some nodding, others looking away. Olivia's eyes flicked to the rosary, then back to the woman's face. "Trouble was already here," she said, her voice steady, but with a quiet force that silenced the murmurs. The woman sat down, her rosary beads clicking as she gripped them tighter. The flight attendant with the clipboard hovered nearby, her face pale, but she didn't say anything. The cabin felt like it was teetering on the edge, every passenger caught between fear and awe. Olivia just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The plane landed in London hours later, the cabin still buzzing with tension. As passengers disembarked, reporters were already waiting at the gate, cameras flashing, microphones shoved forward. A journalist in a bright red blazer pushed through the crowd, her voice loud. "Who are you? Why did the military salute you?" An angry passenger, the guy in the hoodie, shouted. "She's no ordinary traveler. What's her deal?" A little boy, maybe 8, tugged on his mom's sleeve and looked up at Olivia. "Miss, are you a pilot?" he asked, his voice small but clear. The crowd went quiet, everyone waiting for her to speak. Olivia paused, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She smiled just a little, and her voice was steady. "I was a test pilot for the stealth program, Shadow. On paper, I died in an accident 5 years ago." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. The crowd exploded. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, passengers whispered to each other. The businessman stood frozen, his gold watch glinting in the airport lights. The older woman with the pearls clutched her purse, her face pale. The flight attendant with the tight bun backed away, her eyes wide. The captain, still in his uniform, stood off to the side, shaking his head. "The ghost of the skies," he whispered, barely loud enough to hear. Olivia didn't stay for the chaos. She adjusted her backpack and walked through the crowd, her steps steady, her head high. Nobody dared stop her. The little boy watched her go, his eyes wide with wonder. The journalist in the red blazer tried to follow, but Olivia was already gone, disappearing into the airport like she'd never been there. A young reporter, barely out of college, pushed through the crowd, his phone raised to record. "Ma'am, just one question. How did you know the jet was coming?" He shouted, his voice eager but respectful. Olivia paused just for a moment, her hand on her backpack strap. "I've seen that shadow before," she said, her voice low but clear. The reporter's eyes widened, his phone shaking in his hand. The crowd around him buzzed, some passengers nodding as if they finally understood, others still shouting questions. Olivia didn't wait for more. She turned and kept walking, her gray sweater blending into the sea of travelers. The captain watched her go, his hand still on his headset, like he was replaying her words in his mind. The businessman looked down at his shoes, his face flushed with shame. The truth was sinking in, and it was heavier than anyone expected. Back on the plane, the story of 13F spread like wildfire. Passengers posted about it online, their tweets and videos going viral within hours. The businessman, whose name turned out to be Richard Holt, was identified in one of the videos. By the next day, his company had issued a statement, distancing themselves from his behavior, and he was quietly let go. The older woman with the pearls, a retired school teacher named Margaret, found her name trending on social media, her angry comments replayed over and over. She stopped going to her weekly book club, too embarrassed to face her friends. The flight attendant with the tight bun, whose name was Sarah, was reassigned to ground duties after passengers filed complaints about her conduct. None of them faced Olivia directly. They didn't need to. The truth was out, and it was heavy. The woman in the tailored blazer, whose name was Claire, tried to salvage her reputation by posting an apology online, but it was too late. Her followers dropped her, and her sponsorship deals dried up. She was seen at the airport later, her red nails tapping nervously on her phone, trying to explain herself to a friend who wasn't listening. The man in the polo shirt, who had been so loud with his accusations, was identified as a mid-level manager named Greg. His company didn't fire him, but his colleagues stopped inviting him to drinks after work, their silence louder than any punishment. The young mother with the toddler kept the keychain, showing it to her son, years later telling him about the woman who'd known something nobody else did. This story became a quiet legend in their family, a reminder that heroes don't always look the part. Olivia didn't stick around to see the fallout. She was already on her way to wherever she was going next, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her gray sweater blending into the crowd. But the story didn't end with her leaving. People kept talking about 13F, about the woman who'd seen a fighter jet before the radar did, who'd spoken a dead call sign and gotten a salute in return. Flight crews started checking that seat first half, expecting her to be there. Passengers told the story to their friends, their kids, their coworkers. It became a legend, a quiet one. The kind that sticks with you because it feels true. Olivia didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to fight for respect. She just walked away, leaving the truth to do the talking. The story of 13F didn't fade. It lived in the way people told it, in the way it made them feel. It was for the ones who'd been judged, who'd been looked down on, who'd stayed quiet when the world shouted at them. It was for the ones who'd carried their truth in silence, waiting for the moment it would speak for itself. Olivia didn't need to shout. She didn't need to prove anything. Her life, her choices, her presence, they were enough. And for everyone watching, everyone who'd ever felt small or dismissed, her story was a quiet promise. You're not invisible. Your truth matters. It'll come out one way or another. And when it does, the world will see you. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.